This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
It was a quiet night on Brookmill Street, the kind of night where even the wind seemed to stand still. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the pavement slick and glistening under the orange glow of the street lamps. In the distance, the hum of traffic was barely audible. The neighborhood slept in peace, except for one house. The lights inside were far too bright for this hour. They cut through the curtains like interrogation lamps. The front door stood ajar, just enough to invite questions. Outside, a single patrol car idled at the curb, its red and blue lights washing over the wet asphalt. Minutes earlier, a 911 call had come in, the voice on the other end tight, strained, almost trembling. The dispatcher barely had time to ask a question before the line went dead. When first responders arrived, they were met by a scene that didn't belong in this neighborhood. A living room frozen in time. A mug of tea still steaming on the coffee table, a television droning on about tomorrow's weather, and a phone vibrating endlessly on the kitchen counter. But upstairs, was something else. Something that would draw every drop of warmth from the air. A bedroom door half open. The edge of a wedding dress visible inside, draped over a chair like it had been discarded in a hurry. And in the center of the room, still, silent, impossibly still, lay a woman whose life had ended only hours after it had begun again. Her name was Loretta Mayfield, 60 years old. 2 days ago, she had been a bride. The man she married was 30. His name was Darnell Keys. Neighbors had seen them come and go together, laughing, holding hands, looking every bit the picture of new love. Now she was gone. The medical examiner would later call her the sixth, not the first, not the only, the sixth. And that's when the questions began. How did she die? What was she caught in the middle of? And who exactly was the man she trusted with her last vows? Stay with me, because what happened inside that house will change the way you think about love, trust, and the promises people make. Forever. Loretta Mayfield was the kind of woman people spoke about with respect in their voice. 60 years old, and yet there was something timeless in the way she carried herself. She was known for the soft but commanding tone she used as a school principal, a tone that could quiet an entire room without raising her voice. For 3 decades, she guided classrooms full of restless minds, teaching more than just lessons from a textbook. She taught resilience. She taught pride. Her home on the corner of Westview and Lancer had been her sanctuary. The flower beds out front always bloomed in careful symmetry, a sign of her patience and care. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of vanilla candles and fresh bread on Sundays. It was the place her daughters, Simone and Patrice, would come after church, knowing their mother would have a meal ready and the kind of advice only she could give. For 15 years, Loretta lived as a widow. Her husband, Clarence, had been taken by a sudden heart attack one winter night, leaving her with a silence that seemed to stretch for miles. She buried her grief in work, in community service, in mentoring young women at the church. If she ever felt lonely, she rarely showed it. She had a way of putting her own needs in the back seat so others could ride in comfort. But time is a patient whisperer. As the years passed, even Loretta couldn't ignore the weight of evenings spent alone. The sound of her own footsteps in an empty house became a reminder that life is short, and shorter still when it's lived without someone to share it with. It was Simone, her eldest, who had once suggested she at least try meeting someone again. Loretta had smiled and dismissed it, until one evening last spring when a friend from her church group introduced her to an online community, a faith-based dating circle where people wrote more about their values than their favorite movies. That's where she saw him. His profile was unlike the others. While most men posted pictures of themselves leaning against cars or holding up fish, his first photo showed him in a tailored suit, standing in front of a jazz club. His smile was easy, his eyes alert. The bio was short but intentional. Looking for a soul older than my years. Someone I can learn from. Someone I can build with. She didn't message him first. He found her. The first words he sent weren't about her looks. They were about her taste in music. He noticed she loved Coltrane. He told her it was rare to meet someone who understood that kind of sound. From there, messages turned into late-night phone calls. Late-night phone calls turned into coffee dates, and those coffee dates became an inseparable routine. Her friends noticed the change almost instantly. She smiled more. She bought new dresses, bright ones, not the muted tones she usually wore. She spoke about the future in a way she hadn't in years, and when she introduced him to her family, she did so with the quiet confidence of a woman who believed she had finally found something worth keeping. But belief is a delicate thing. It doesn't take much to shatter it. Darnell Keys was 30 years old, but he carried himself like a man who knew the art of presentation. He was tall, with a lean frame that seemed sculpted for the fitted suits he wore. His smile was quick, perfectly timed, and almost always accompanied by a reassuring hand on your shoulder or a steady look in the eye. When Loretta's friends first met him, they admitted, privately, that he was disarming. He had a way of making you feel like you'd known him longer than the few minutes you'd spent in his company. He listened more than he spoke, at least at first, and when he did speak, it was with stories about his ambitions, his faith, and his gratitude for the woman standing beside him. On paper, his life was harder to pin down. He said he'd grown up in Baton Rouge, raised by his grandmother after his parents separated. He'd moved to Houston in his early 20s, picking up a mix of jobs: valet parking, selling gym memberships, working as a driver for a private transportation service. There were hints of something more entrepreneurial. He spoke vaguely about a small business he was building. Sometimes it was a clothing brand. Other times it was a real estate venture. But the details always seemed to shift depending on who was asking. Loretta didn't question it. Not then. She told friends he was just figuring things out, and that his focus on her was proof enough of his priorities. What stood out most to her was his attentiveness. He remembered the little things: her favorite flowers, the way she liked her tea, the gospel songs that reminded her of childhood. When he visited, he often brought small gifts: a silk scarf, a book she'd mentioned once in passing, a new pair of garden gloves. But there were moments, rare and easy to overlook, when his charm dimmed. A question about his past would be met with a quick change of subject. If a conversation lingered too long on his family, his voice would grow quiet, and his gaze would drift away. Loretta's daughter, Patrice, remembered one Sunday afternoon when Darnell joined them for dinner. He laughed and joked with everyone until Patrice asked how long his last relationship had been. For a split second, his expression went flat. He said a little over a year, then returned to smiling as if nothing had happened. Loretta brushed it off as shyness, but Patrice would later remember that look. The truth, the full truth, was that Darnell Keys had been married before, twice, and neither marriage had ended in the usual way. It began with a message. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Loretta sat in her living room, the soft hum of her dishwasher in the background, her laptop resting on the arm of her chair. She had joined the faith-based dating site weeks earlier, but hadn't been active. It felt strange to her, scrolling through profiles, trying to imagine love through a screen. And then his name appeared. Darnell K. The first line of his message didn't mention her smile or her eyes. Instead, it read, "You're the first person I've seen here who lists Coltrane as their favorite." It was simple, but it caught her. They began exchanging short messages, polite at first, cautious in tone. But soon the conversations lengthened, spilling over into late-night calls that stretched past midnight. Loretta found herself laughing more, telling stories she hadn't told in years. Darnell spoke about his faith, his dreams of owning a business, and his belief that love was the one investment worth risking everything for. Their first meeting was in a small coffee shop just outside the city. Loretta arrived 10 minutes early, her heart racing in a way she hadn't felt since she was a young woman. She wore a soft blue dress and a thin gold chain her late husband had given her. When Darnell walked in, he spotted her instantly. He moved toward her with the easy confidence of someone stepping into a room he already owned. The hug was brief but warm. Over steaming mugs of coffee, they spoke as if there had never been a need for introductions. After that day, the rhythm of their connection fell into place quickly. A phone call in the morning, a text at lunch, dinner at least twice a week. He brought flowers, not store-bought bouquets, but arrangements that felt hand-picked, as if he'd taken time to notice the blooms she admired when they walked through the park. Loretta's friends began to notice a lightness in her. She started wearing brighter colors, her hair styled differently, a soft glow in her cheeks. She spoke about Darnell with a certainty that made even her cautious friends want to believe in him. But there were moments, barely noticeable, easy to explain away, that would later take on a sharper meaning. Once, while they were out to dinner, a man approached their table. He greeted Darnell by name, asked where he'd been lately. Darnell's smile never wavered, but his hand tightened slightly over Loretta's. He ended the conversation quickly, saying, "That's a story for another time," before steering the topic back to her. Another time, he canceled a date last minute, claiming a business meeting had come up. Loretta didn't think much of it then. Their relationship moved fast. 6 months after that first coffee date, Darnell proposed in the garden behind her church. A small velvet box, a simple gold ring, and a promise whispered in her ear, "I'll spend the rest of my life making you feel safe." 2 days after their wedding, she would be gone. The morning of the wedding was warm, the kind of September day that feels like summer is holding on a little longer than it should. Loretta's church stood at the center of the neighborhood, its white steeple catching the light as guests arrived in soft pastels and Sunday suits. Inside, the air was filled with the faint scent of lilies and polished wood. Family and friends gathered in the pews, turning in their seats each time the heavy doors opened. The whispers were warm. Everyone spoke about how good it was to see Loretta happy again. She wore a simple ivory gown, elegant in its restraint, with a thin satin belt at the waist. Her daughter stood beside her, smiling through tears. When the music began and she stepped into the aisle, heads turned. Some guests would later say they'd never seen her look so young. Darnell stood at the front, his suit perfectly cut, a gold tie catching the light. His smile was steady, his posture confident. When Loretta reached him, he took her hands in his and mouthed the words, "I love you," before the pastor spoke. The ceremony was short, filled with vows that felt heavy with sincerity. They promised faithfulness, respect, and care for each other, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health. Rings were exchanged, hands were joined, and the room erupted in applause when they were pronounced husband and wife. The reception was held in the church hall. There was food, laughter, music. Loretta danced with her daughters, then with her new husband, their steps slow, deliberate, as if they were in no rush for the song to end. Guests toasted to their happiness. Cameras flashed. But even in celebration, small details began to etch themselves into memory. One of Loretta's close friends, Delphine, noticed how Darnell's attention seemed to shift throughout the evening. He laughed and mingled with ease, but now and then, his gaze would drift to his phone, his fingers brushing the screen before he slipped it back into his pocket. Late into the reception, Patrice stepped outside to take a call. Through the window, she caught sight of Darnell in the parking lot, speaking with someone in low, clipped tones. When he noticed her watching, he smiled, walked over, and said he'd just been checking in with a business associate. It didn't seem like much then. Just a small, odd moment on an otherwise perfect day. 2 days later, that perfection would be replaced by flashing lights, police tape, and questions no one knew how to answer. It was a Tuesday afternoon just after 2 o'clock when Loretta's sister, Evelyn, pulled into the driveway on Brookmill Street. She had called earlier to confirm their lunch plans, but Loretta hadn't answered. That was unusual. Loretta was the type to be ready 15 minutes early, coat in hand, shoes by the door. The front yard was still, the air thick with the weight of late summer heat. Evelyn noticed the blinds in the living room were open, something Loretta rarely did during the day. She knocked, once, twice, then again, harder. No answer. The front door gave way under the slightest push. Inside, the house was unnervingly quiet. The television hummed in the background, tuned to a daytime talk show, the volume low. On the counter sat a mug of tea, still warm enough to release a faint curl of steam. Beside it, Loretta's phone buzzed against the wood, lit with missed calls. Evelyn's voice cracked as she called out her sister's name. She moved through the living room, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. In the hallway, the air felt cooler, heavier. The bedroom door upstairs was half open. A wedding dress lay draped over the back of a chair, its satin catching the dim light from the window. Evelyn stepped inside. Loretta was on the bed, lying on her back, her head turned slightly to the side. Her eyes were closed, her skin unnaturally pale. One arm rested limply by her side, the other bent at the elbow, fingers curled inwards. Evelyn froze. For a moment she told herself her sister was sleeping. She moved closer, calling her name again, her voice trembling. She reached out, touched Loretta's shoulder, and felt a coldness that hollowed her from the inside. Her scream broke the stillness. Within minutes, the quiet street was alive with the flashing red and blue of emergency vehicles. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering, their eyes fixed on the open door. Paramedics rushed inside but left without urgency. They carried no stretcher. By the time the police began stringing yellow tape across the lawn, one thing was clear. Whatever had happened inside this house, it hadn't been natural. 2 days earlier, Loretta had been a bride. Now her name was entering a report as the sixth in a list no one wanted to exist. The examination began at dawn the next morning inside the Harris County Medical Examiner's office. The fluorescent lights were harsh, unblinking, illuminating every detail without mercy. Loretta's body lay on a stainless steel table, tagged, documented, and prepared for the process that would speak for her when she no longer could. The medical examiner, Dr. Renee Holloway, was methodical. She'd seen thousands of cases, but she would later admit that something about this one felt wrong from the start. Externally, Loretta appeared peaceful. No obvious wounds, no signs of a struggle visible to the casual eye. But Dr. Holloway's trained gaze lingered on subtle markings, small oval-shaped contusions on both wrists, faint but unmistakable, pressure marks that suggested restraint. Her eyes, beneath closed lids, showed petechial hemorrhages, tiny red spots caused by broken capillaries, often linked to suffocation. When Dr. Holloway examined her airway, she found another sign, mild bruising along the neck muscles, deeper than what could be explained by normal handling after death. It was consistent with force, not an accident, not a medical condition. Then came the toxicology. Hours later, the lab returned its findings. Loretta's blood contained measurable traces of zolpidem, a sedative prescribed for sleep disorders. She had no prescription on record. The concentration in her system was enough to leave her disoriented, vulnerable, and unable to resist. The conclusion was chilling in its clarity. Loretta Mayfield had not died by natural causes. She had been sedated and then deprived of air. Dr. Holloway signed the preliminary report and passed it to the detectives. The manner of death, homicide. For investigators, this was the moment the story changed. A wedding gone wrong was no longer a tragic mystery. It was now a criminal investigation, and there was only one person who had been with her in those final hours. Detectives Marcus Tillman and Valerie Rhodes arrived on Brookmill Street less than 24 hours after the autopsy report was signed. The preliminary evidence was clear enough. This wasn't a case for the coroner to close quietly. This was homicide. Their first stop was the widower. Darnell Keys met them at the door, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. His tie was loose, as if he'd been interrupted in the middle of getting ready to leave. His voice was even, his expression calm, though his eyes had the alertness of someone already calculating the weight of every word he would speak. He told them Loretta had been fine the night before. They'd eaten dinner, watched television, and gone to bed early. He claimed he woke up to find her unresponsive, her skin cold. He said he panicked, tried CPR, then called 911. Detective Rhodes asked about the mug of tea found on the counter. Darnell shrugged, said she'd like to drink it before bed. Asked if Loretta was taking any medications. He shook his head. Number she was healthy. No heart problems. No complaints in recent weeks. When they pressed for details about their wedding day, his answers grew shorter. He mentioned nothing unusual, nothing that stood out. His version of events was neat, almost too neat. No pauses to think, no moments of hesitation. Then came the timeline. Darnell said he'd gone out earlier that morning to meet a potential client for his business, leaving Loretta asleep. He returned an hour later to find her gone. But security camera footage from a convenience store 3 blocks away told a different story. It showed him at the counter at 7:42 a.m., buying a single bottle of water and nothing else. The meeting he spoke of couldn't be confirmed. As detectives began to peel back layers of his life, more inconsistencies surfaced. His work history was vague. The business had no registered address. The cars he drove were in other people's names. And there was something else. Whispers in old police files from Louisiana about 2 former partners who had died under suspicious circumstances. Darnell's calm demeanor never broke in those early interviews. But the more they learned about him, the more it seemed Loretta's death was part of something far larger and far more deliberate. In the days after Loretta's death, Detectives Tillman and Rhodes began pulling threads from Darnell's past. What they found was not a straight line, but a chain. 6 women linked by one man, and a set of circumstances that grew harder to dismiss as coincidence. Victim 1, Althea Morgan, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Darnell was 22. Althea was 26, a nursing student with a warm smile and a habit of sending him packed lunches. They'd been dating just under a year when neighbors reported hearing a crash in the early hours of the morning. Althea was found at the bottom of a narrow staircase in her apartment, her neck broken. The official ruling, accidental fall. There were no witnesses. Victim 2, Jasmine Lattimore, Houston, Texas. Darnell's first wife. Married at 25, she died 10 months later in what was recorded as natural causes. Sudden cardiac arrest while sleeping. No autopsy was performed. Within weeks, Darnell collected on a modest life insurance policy Jasmine had taken out months before her death. Victim 3, Kira Hill, a girlfriend he lived with briefly. Her death was attributed to a seizure in the middle of the night. Toxicology at the time showed trace amounts of sedatives, but because she had a prescription for sleep medication, the case was never pursued. Victim 4, Monique Granger, Austin, Texas, met Darnell through a gym where he worked part-time. They dated for 6 months before she was found dead from an apparent overdose. Friends swore she didn't use drugs. The case stalled after police labeled it accidental. Victim 5, Shalonda Pierce, engaged to Darnell for only 2 months before calling off the wedding. She disappeared 3 weeks later. Her body was never found. Her family still lists her as missing. Now, Loretta Mayfield was the 6th. The similarities were too sharp to ignore. Sudden deaths in healthy women, inconsistent explanations. Financial gain in at least 3 cases. And always Darnell at the center, grieving, explaining, and moving on before questions could gain traction. For detectives, the picture was clear enough. Loretta's death wasn't the tragic first chapter of a new marriage. It was the continuation of a pattern stretching back nearly a decade. But knowing and proving are 2 different things. And Darnell Keys had walked away unscathed 5 times before. When investigators stepped back and looked at the full picture, they saw a man who operated with patience, precision, and a clear end goal. Darnell Keys didn't simply meet women, he studied them. He learned their routines, their habits, their hopes, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. The motive was layered, but always anchored in 2 things: money and control. Financial records showed that in 3 of the previous cases, Darnell had direct access to his partner's accounts within months of the relationship starting. In Loretta's case, he was added to a joint account just 12 days after their engagement. Life insurance policies appeared like clockwork, often small enough to avoid scrutiny, but significant enough to matter. But money alone didn't explain the pattern. Detectives believed there was something else, a need to dominate the people closest to him. Friends of the earlier victims described sudden changes in their personalities after meeting him. They stopped seeing certain friends. They became quieter, more withdrawn. One co-worker of Kira Hill said it was as if he rewrote her life without her noticing. The method was disturbingly consistent. It began with trust, gifts, attention, a performance of devotion that made his partners feel chosen. Once that trust was secured, he positioned himself at the center of their daily lives. And when the time came, he ensured they would be defenseless. In Loretta's case, it was the sedative, zolpidem, a dose large enough to cloud her senses and strip away her ability to resist. The bruising on her wrist suggested restraint. Whether from holding her in place or binding her, the evidence didn't say. But once the drug took hold, she would have been unable to fight. The final act was always the same: asphyxiation. No weapon to leave behind, no blood, no sound loud enough to wake the neighbors. It was the kind of killing that could pass, at a glance, as a quiet death in the night. And for years it had, until Loretta. Her autopsy had caught what others missed, and now the quiet control Darnell Keys had maintained for so long was beginning to crack. The trial of Darnell Keys opened in the Harris County Criminal Court 10 months after Loretta's death. By then, the story had spread beyond Houston, drawing the kind of media attention reserved for cases that feel both unbelievable and all too possible. The prosecution's table was stacked with binders, photographs, forensic reports, financial records, each page a piece of the life Loretta had lived and the death she had suffered. At the defense table, Darnell sat in a tailored navy suit, his posture upright, his expression composed. To the casual observer, he could have been a man attending a business meeting, not someone accused of murder. Assistant District Attorney Camille Bryant laid out the case with precision. She began with the autopsy, walking the jury through each finding: the wrist contusions, the petechial hemorrhages, the sedative in Loretta's blood. She explained how these details, when put together, told a story that was impossible to mistake for anything but homicide. Then she widened the frame. One by one, the names of the other 5 women were read aloud. Their photos appeared on a screen, smiling, vibrant, full of life. And next to each face, the circumstances of their death. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that these prior cases had never resulted in charges, that they were irrelevant. But Judge Harold Simmons allowed the pattern to be shown, ruling that the similarities spoke to intent. The defense strategy was simple: cast doubt on the science. Their expert, a toxicologist hired at considerable cost, claimed the sedative levels in Loretta's system were within a range that could be accidental. They suggested she might have taken the medication unknowingly, perhaps mixed with alcohol, leading to a fatal reaction. They painted Darnell as a grieving husband, a man who had finally found love only to have it ripped away. They spoke of his good character, of the baseless speculation about his past relationships. But the prosecution had something more powerful than speculation. They had the bank statements showing the transfer of funds to an account in Darnell's name just a week before Loretta's death. They had the life insurance policy, signed and filed 2 months earlier, naming him as the sole beneficiary. And they had Evelyn, Loretta's sister, who stood in front of the jury, her voice steady as she recounted walking into that house, seeing her sister, and knowing before the paramedics even arrived that this was not natural. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Each day, the courtroom seemed to tighten, the air growing heavier as the evidence piled higher. When both sides rested, the jurors were left with 2 pictures: one of a devoted husband who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and another of a man who had quietly ended 6 lives without leaving a single scream for anyone to hear. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. In the hushed hallways outside the courtroom, the air was thick with waiting. Families of the women whose names had filled the trial sat together on the wooden benches. Not just Loretta's daughters and sister, but the relatives of the others who had come before her. For them, this wasn't just about one verdict. It was about closing a door that had been left open far too long. When the clerk announced that the jury had reached a decision, the room filled quickly. The creak of chairs echoed as everyone took their places. Darnell sat at the defense table, hands folded, face unreadable. The foreman's voice was steady. On the charge of murder in the first degree, guilty. Loretta's daughters closed their eyes. Evelyn gripped the edge of her seat. Across the aisle, the families of the other women began to weep quietly, grief and relief woven into the same sound. The judge called for order, then turned to sentencing. Given the nature of the crime, the clear evidence of premeditation, and the pattern of similar deaths tied to the defendant, the court imposed the maximum penalty allowed: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Darnell's reaction was slight, a tilt of the head, a quick inhale through the nose, before he stood and allowed the deputies to place cuffs on his wrists. He did not look toward Loretta's family. He did not look at the jury. As he was led away, the judge's final words hung in the air. Justice for one cannot undo the past, but today we mark the end of it, repeating. For the families in that room, it was both an ending and a reminder of what could never be undone. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon. Outside, the late sun fell across the steps, casting long shadows over the people gathered there. For some, the verdict felt like closure. For others, it was a wound that would never truly heal. Loretta's daughters stood together, their hands intertwined. Simone spoke softly to a reporter, her voice steady but heavy. She said her mother had always believed in the goodness of people, even when life gave her reason to doubt it. She said she wished that trust hadn't been the thing that took her away. Evelyn chose not to speak to the cameras. Instead, she moved to the edge of the crowd, holding a small framed photo of her sister. In it, Loretta was laughing, her head tilted back, eyes alive with a joy that now felt like a relic from another time. For Detectives Tillman and Rhodes, the case closed on paper, but not in their minds. They knew there were other names, other women whose stories had ended too soon. They knew that for 5 families, the answers might never be as clear as they were for Loretta's. In the weeks that followed, her church held a memorial service. The pews were filled with former students, neighbors, colleagues, people who had known her as more than just a headline. They spoke about her kindness, her discipline, the way she could make you believe you were capable of more than you thought. The service ended with music, the same Coltrane piece she had once mentioned in her online profile. As the final notes faded, the silence in the room was profound, as if the air itself was honoring her. But beyond that quiet sanctuary, life moved on. The story faded from the front page. Another case, another tragedy took its place in the news cycle. And yet, for those who had been close to Loretta, and for those who had followed every twist of the trial, one truth remained. Danger often wears the face of someone you trust. This story doesn't end with a guilty verdict. It doesn't end with a sentence, or a set of prison bars, or the name of a man locked away for the rest of his life. Because the truth is, there are others like him. Right now somewhere, someone is weaving their way into another person's trust, smiling in their photos, learning their routines, knowing exactly how and when to strike. Loretta Mayfield was the 6th. She should have been the last. But if history has shown anything, it's that patterns don't break themselves. The next time you see a friend rushing into something that feels too perfect, the next time someone you care about ignores the quiet red flags, remember her name. Remember the names of the 5 women before her. And ask the questions that could save a life. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the faces behind the smiles, share it. Let someone else hear it. Because silence is the thing predators count on most. And if you want more true stories that matter, stories that expose the truth, no matter how hidden, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and join the conversation in the comments. The only way we stop the next name from being added to that list is by talking about it now.